On a hot day in August 1912, the traffic in London came to a complete standstill. It was for the funeral of an ex-pawnbroker's apprentice from Nottingham. Thousands crowded the streets to mourn a man who had dedicated his life to serving the forgotten people. His name was William Booth, General William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army. William was born in 1829 in Nottingham. The only fame achieved by his father Samuel, a builder, was to be reported for bankruptcy in the local paper. It was a time of great poverty throughout Britain. Lack of agricultural jobs and the rapid development of city industries caused people to flock in from the countryside to find employment. Inadequate housing was hastily built for factory workers. Highly contagious diseases like cholera and typhoid would spread quickly through these slum communities. Sweatshops abounded, where young children were compelled to work 14 hours a day in high temperatures and were punished for simply looking out of the window. Misery was a fact of life, and many people drank heavily to try and forget. There was no state concern for the poor. The priority of the government was to protect Britain from enemies abroad rather than from poverty within. At the age of 13, William Booth's father sent him to work for a pawnbroker in Goosegate, Nottingham.
He was very quickly made aware of the poverty around him. He was aware of children crying on the streets for bread. He was aware in his pawnbroker's apprenticeship, which began when he was 13, of women coming into the shop and pawning their wedding rings, the last vestige of respectability, so that they might get money to feed their children.
When his father died a year later, William felt the pinch even more as he became the family's breadwinner. Anger at the desperation around him made him determined to join the Chartist movement in order to campaign for justice for the poor. But when he was 15, a Methodist friend invited him to a Wesleyan chapel. What he heard about God's love began to make sense to him. He decided to give his life to God and was immediately filled with an overwhelming sense of joy and purpose.
I feel that I could willingly and joyfully travel to the ends of the earth for Jesus Christ and suffer anything imaginable to help the souls of other men.
Soon after, he heard a visiting evangelist preaching and was deeply affected by his straightforward style and the way he urged people to make a decision.
It made an ineffaceable impression on my mind, filling me with confidence in the power and willingness of God to save all those that come unto him.
When a friend later invited him to lead meetings in the Nottingham slums, William found that people responded when he spoke about God's love. He saw men who'd happily spend all the family money on drink, turning to God and away from alcohol. William, at 17, was now experimenting with a pattern which greatly influenced how he worked in the future.
We obtained the loan of cottages, and in these held meetings every night, always commencing with an open-air address, fine weather or foul, all the year round, inviting the people indoors for another meeting. Here again we had lively songs, short and sharp exhortations, insisting upon decision for Christ on the spot, which was to be signified by coming out and kneeling at the round table that stood in the middle of the room.
Hope was injected into their lives, and that made a vast difference, and lifted them out of their despair and gloom, and helped them to believe in themselves, and that a future could be carved.
When he was 20, he was forced to leave Nottingham for London to find work to support his mother and sisters. In his free time on Sundays, he preached in Methodist chapels. A wealthy Methodist shoemaker, Edward Rabbits, was so captivated by his preaching that he offered to pay him 20 shillings a week so that he could become a full-time minister. William leapt at the chance. Edward Rabbits also arranged for him to meet Catherine Mumford. Catherine, born in Derbyshire in the same year as William, had written in her diary about the kind of husband she would consider.
He must be a sincere Christian. He should be a man of sense. I could never respect a fool. I will never marry a man who is not a total abstainer, and this from conviction, and not merely to gratify me. He should perhaps be a minister. I could be most useful to God as a minister's wife. He should be dark and tall, and for preference called William.
So in 1855, Catherine and William were married.
It seemed to be a lifelong love affair. It was also a meeting of minds. Catherine was very much an intellectual, self-made, albeit, but William was a pragmatist. And yes, I think it was a fine combination. She probably added caution to his impetuosity, but that's no bad thing.
In the early years of their marriage, they travelled round England holding meetings, as much as Catherine's delicate health allowed. The first 3 of their 8 children were born in different towns.
I think it was quite extraordinary family life. In a way, could only have been extraordinary by someone of General Booth's, I use the word, obsession with his destiny. And there's no question that he was devoted to her. There's no question that she was the emotional, at least in earthly terms, centre of his life. Same with his family. The children with whom they were both hugely strict, I might say. But although he was devoted to her, he never let her stand in the way of his calling.
In the midst of the discomfort of this gypsy lifestyle, both discovered more about their different abilities. In Gateshead, William found huge numbers were being converted through his preaching in the Methodist chapel, while Catherine began working with alcoholic men. Within a few weeks, 10 of these men had turned away from drinking and met her each week for Bible reading and prayer. Catherine was a very liberated woman for her time. She didn't hold to the Victorian male view that women had no right to speak in public and had no opinions worth hearing. She'd read the Bible through many times and knew the teaching that in Christ there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus. So when she heard an inner voice telling her to preach, she knew God was speaking to her. With great fear and trepidation, she acted on it, and found that William and the Gateshead congregation welcomed her preaching enthusiastically. Later on in London, she held her own series of evangelistic meetings and gained great respect amongst the middle and upper classes. Prime Minister Gladstone and Queen Victoria were among the many people who consulted her.
Many of the things which, shall we say, William achieved were only achievable because of the strength, the support, the vision of Catherine.
William, meanwhile, was still searching restlessly for the particular work he felt God was calling him to. He resigned in frustration from Methodism in 1861 because he felt he was being limited in his ministry. It was a bewildering time, and 30 years later, William said,
I see in all the unpleasant experiences of my early days the hand of God himself, leading me by a way that I knew not, that I could scarcely believe at the time to be his way.
When the family eventually found themselves in London, William received an unexpected invitation from a group called the East London Special Services Committee, who wanted him to lead meetings in a tattered tent in Whitechapel. He accepted unwillingly because he wasn't sure of his ability to communicate with people from such poor backgrounds. When he wasn't preaching, he walked the East End streets, where every 5th shop sold gin, even to 5-year-olds, and where mothers fed their babies on cheap beer. These were scenes of heartbreak for William as he remembered his Nottingham days and felt the desperation of these East End families. He wasn't the failure he expected to be, and during the fortnight felt strangely drawn, as he put it, to these people who had never heard such preaching before.
Here is a sphere, was being whispered continually in my inward ear by an inward voice. Why go farther afield for audiences?
William knew then that this was where God wanted him to be.
It was obvious from the start that this man had a special aura. There was just something about him. He spoke the language of the people. He spoke the things of God in terms that the people could understand and relate to. Of course, his background and the poverty he had seen in Nottingham and the poverty-stricken people that he had often served in the pawn shop, all that really added up to make him the kind of man that he was, a man for the people.
The work was hard and demanded creative responses to difficult situations. The old tent blew down irretrievably one night, and William and his fellow Christian missioners searched for a venue that East End people would feel at home in. They found a dance hall for the Sunday meetings, while on weeknights they met in an old wool warehouse in Bethnal Green. More and more meeting places were needed for the growing numbers. In Poplar, they met in a smelly shed between a stable and a pigsty. In Old Ford, they met in a carpenter's shop. In Whitechapel, they met in a skittle alley. And in Shoreditch, they met in a stuffy room behind a pigeon shop. Money raised by Catherine's upper-class contacts meant that William was later able to rent the old Effingham Theatre.
There regularly mounted 40, 50 and 60 sinners onto the stage on a Sunday night seeking mercy. In this dirty theatre, at the time perhaps one of the lowest in London, we were fairly introduced to the public, and from that day the work went forward with increased rapidity.
William and Catherine, by now the leaders of the newly named Christian Mission, encouraged these early converts to go to churches and chapels to learn more about their new faith.
Many of these churches were not happy with their pews being occupied by dirty, ragged, illiterate, smelly individuals. And it was those kinds of people that were responding to Booth's message. And so he discovered he had a problem in his hands. What will he do with these people? They were coming back to him and they were saying that there's really no welcome for us there.
Well, of course, they had to begin training them. And because William Booth was a pragmatist, he realised very early on that like attracts like. And if you've got a converted boxer or a converted boozer or a converted thief, their mates would come and listen to them. They knew what they were like before they were converted, and they were impressed by the change they'd seen in those lives.
True to form, William and Catherine couldn't ignore the physical needs of the people they encountered each day, and the Christian Mission's first report in 1867 shows just how much they responded. It lists evening classes, ragged schools, reading rooms, penny banks, soup kitchens, and relief for the poor by distribution of bread, meat, and small sums of money. The People's Market in Whitechapel became the mission headquarters for organising all this activity, with Catherine's expert advice. 16-year-old Bramwell Booth ran a small chain of food for the million shops, which provided the poor with hot soup at all hours and three-course dinners for sixpence. These were revolutionary activities in their time, and came simply out of a compassionate and immediate response to people in need.
Poor people feel the cold quite as much, if not more, than do the rich people. No one gets a blessing if they have cold feet, and nobody ever got saved while they had the toothache.
Booth took the view, which is now, I guess, regarded as over-modern in some quarters, that poverty and sin went together. I mean, there's letters and speeches time after time that the man who is poor is more likely to steal. The man who is poor is more likely to take refuge in drink. The woman who is destitute is more likely to go out onto the streets. It seemed to me to be self-evident, but a lot of people didn't believe it then, and some people don't believe it now. But William Booth said, if we're going to attack the devil, we must attack those things which the devil used as his allies.
At this time, England was expecting to go to war against Russia, and street conversations buzzed with the prospect. The Christian missioners started describing their own work as a war against the devil. Their exciting military-sounding phrases attracted people. Then, in 1878, William, Bramwell and others were checking an article for the Christian Mission's annual report. The Christian Mission, it said, is a volunteer army. Bramwell interrupted to say, "I'm not a volunteer, I'm a regular or nothing." William stopped short, thought hard for a moment and seized his pen. He crossed out volunteer and wrote salvation. "The Christian Mission," read Bramwell out loud, "is a salvation army."
The idea caught on like wildfire, and people got caught up in a tremendous wave of revival that came in those years, and many people found God and found hope and found a cause to which they could happily identify themselves.
As the Salvation Army grew, it began to develop the outward military characteristics which we now associate with it. The uniforms, the flag, and of course, the music. Music had always been extremely important to William and Catherine.
Music has a divine effect upon divinely influenced and directed souls. Music is to the soul what the wind is to the ship, blowing her onward in the direction in which she is steered.
William used lively tunes, often played by brass bands, to attract people to meetings. Members of his family and other Salvationists wrote lyrics to well-known melodies, such as "A Life on the Ocean Wave" and "Marching Through Georgia." William wrote in spirited defence to his critics.
Secular music, do you say, belongs to the devil, does it? Well, he's the thief. Every note and every harmony is divine and belongs to us.
Now that the Salvation Army had found such a strong identity, it spread rapidly throughout the world in its battle against evil. But in Britain in the early 1880s, the fight was bitter. Salvationists campaigned hard against excessive drinking, and many pubs came close to ruin as heavy drinkers turned to God. As a result, landlords bribed customers to create disturbances at open-air meetings. They organised a skeleton army, and Salvationists were often pelted with rotten fruit, mud, and other missiles as they marched. Riots erupted, and Salvationists came off badly in court as well as in the street. The right to march and to hold open-air meetings was the main issue, and opposition continued at least until 1912. Undeterred by the opposition, William battled on against the many social evils which continued to raise their ugly heads. In response to the plight of rough sleepers, the army opened food and shelter depots, the first of their kind, and these were immediately besieged by more homeless and hungry people than the army could cope with. Funds to support ventures like this were in very short supply, so to earn money, William began writing a book about the grim situation in what he called Darkest England. But life in the Booth home now took a grim turn. Catherine, called affectionately the Army Mother, became seriously ill. She died aged 61, surrounded by her family. There was great sadness at her death. She had been beside William in all his struggles, giving wise counsel to him and to countless others. She was publicly acknowledged as one of the most remarkable women of the 19th century, and was as much a founder of the Salvation Army as William was.
It was a devastating blow to him. He never recovered really from her death. He missed her immensely. So for a further 22 years before his own death in 1912, the same year as the sinking of the Titanic, he threw himself just unreservedly into his work.
He finished his book, In Darkest England and the Way Out, in which he poured out his feelings about the way things were.
Every cab horse in London has three things: